The first laugh came before Malcolm Jefferson even sat down. It rolled across the room like a loose bolt bouncing on concrete. A few people chuckled, then more joined in. By the time Malcolm reached the third row of folding chairs inside the Cottonwood County Agricultural Hall, nearly half the room was grinning. Not because he had told a joke, because of what he had brought with him. A cardboard tube nearly 6 feet long rested under his arm. Blueprints. Hundreds of farmers had gathered that Thursday evening in April of 1986. The room smelled of coffee, dust, diesel fuel, and rain-soaked work jackets. Men who measured life in harvests sat shoulder to shoulder discussing fertilizer prices, wheat futures, and machinery loans. Nobody brought blueprints to these meetings. Except Malcolm Jefferson. At 58 years old, Malcolm looked older than his age. His denim jacket had been repaired so many times the stitching looked like a road map. His hands carried deep cracks from decades of work. His boots were worn smooth at the edges. But his eyes never seemed tired. They seemed busy, always watching, always measuring, always thinking. The meeting had barely begun when Curtis Holloway noticed the tube. Curtis was the county's most respected agricultural voice. Tall, confident, perfectly pressed shirt. The kind of man who never entered a room wondering if he belonged there. He pointed toward Malcolm. "What've you got there?" Several heads turned. Malcolm glanced up. "Plans for what?" The room quieted. Malcolm hesitated. For a second it almost looked like he might keep the answer to himself. Then he spoke. "I'm planting 4,000 trees." Silence, 3 heartbeats. Then laughter exploded. A man near the back nearly spilled his coffee. Another slapped the table. Someone whistled. Curtis leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Trees?" Malcolm nodded. Along every field edge. More laughter. Someone called out, "You opening a forest preserve?" Another voice. "Maybe he's getting into lumber." A third. "Maybe he forgot he's farming wheat." The room roared again. Malcolm didn't. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out an old brass watch. The watch had belonged to his father. The glass was cracked. The chain had been repaired twice. He checked the time, closed the lid, and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he sat quietly while everyone laughed. That made them laugh harder. Because people expect you to defend yourself. They expect excuses, arguments, anger. Malcolm gave them none. Curtis finally wiped tears from his eyes. "Trees take water, Malcolm." "I know. They take nutrients." "I know. They cast shade." "I know. You'll lose acreage." "I know." Curtis spread his hands. "Then why would you do it?" For the first time that evening, Malcolm looked directly at him. Not angry, not embarrassed, just calm. Because everybody's looking at the crop. The room waited, and nobody's looking at the wind. The laughter returned immediately, even louder. The meeting moved on. But the nickname was born that night. Tree Farmer. By sunrise the next morning, half the county was already using it. By the following week, everyone was. The nickname followed Malcolm everywhere. The feed store, the diner, the bank, church parking lots, the grain elevator. "Morning, Tree Farmer. How's the forest coming? Seen any squirrels yet?" The jokes never stopped. Not once. 3 weeks later, Malcolm's first shipment arrived. 800 young saplings. Bundles of cottonwood and cedar. The delivery truck pulled into his driveway at dawn. His son Darius stepped onto the porch holding a cup of coffee. He stared at the truck, then at the trees. Then back at his father. "You actually did it." Malcolm nodded. Darius rubbed his face. The mortgage payment was already late. The combine needed repairs. Diesel prices were climbing. And now hundreds of trees sat in their driveway. "You spent money on this." "Yes, how much?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Darius looked away. For the first time, Malcolm saw something worse than doubt. Fear, real fear. Not fear of failure, fear of losing everything. That evening, after supper, Darius found the old notebook. It sat on the kitchen table beside Malcolm's cold coffee. The leather cover was faded nearly white. Its pages bulged from years of notes. Numbers, wind directions, rainfall measurements, hand-drawn maps, temperature logs. Darius flipped through page after page, thousands of entries. Dates stretching back years. Some pages were so worn they looked ready to fall apart. "What is all this?" Malcolm glanced up from the window. "Observations. For what? The future." Darius sighed. He wanted a real answer. Instead, he got another one of his father's riddles. Outside, thunder rolled across the Oklahoma horizon. A storm was coming. The next morning, Malcolm planted the first row, then the second, then the third. By the end of summer, hundreds of trees stretched across the property. The county laughed harder than ever. Even the bank manager started making jokes. Until September, when something happened nobody expected. A visiting meteorologist from Oklahoma State stopped at the farm after noticing the unusual tree pattern from an aerial survey. His name was Dr. Leonard Brooks. He spent 20 minutes looking at Malcolm's notebook. Then he stopped turning pages. His expression changed, completely. He looked back at Malcolm, then at the notebook, then at Malcolm again. You recorded all this yourself? Malcolm nodded. How many years? 6. Dr. Brooke sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, nobody spoke. Finally, the scientist pointed to a page, then another, then another. His voice had become strangely quiet. Do you realize what you've found? Malcolm didn't answer. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure yet. But for the first time in 6 years, someone else was. And outside, beyond the kitchen window, dark storm clouds were gathering over Cottonwood County. Much faster than they should have been. The storm arrived 3 days later, not a tornado, not the kind that made national news. This one was worse in a quieter way. It was wind. Pure wind. The kind that strips moisture from the earth, without anyone noticing until the damage is already done. By noon, the sky above Cottonwood County had turned a strange pale brown. Dust drifted across the roads in thin sheets. Visibility dropped. Highway patrol officers issued warnings. Most people stayed indoors. Malcolm didn't. He stood beside the newest row of saplings with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching, measuring, listening. Darius pulled his truck beside him and climbed out. The wind immediately grabbed at his shirt. You've been standing out here for an hour. Malcolm nodded. You should be inside. No answer. The younger man followed his father's gaze. The trees bent. Not much, just enough. As though they were testing the wind, learning it. Darius shook his head. You can't seriously think a few rows of trees are going to stop this. For several seconds, Malcolm didn't speak. Then he pointed, not at the trees, at the soil. Darius looked down. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed it. The loose topsoil wasn't moving. The neighboring field was losing dirt by the minute. Dust streamed across the highway. But here, near the young tree line, the soil remained surprisingly stable. Darius frowned. The difference was subtle, small, yet impossible to ignore once seen. The older man finally spoke. Everything starts small. The wind continued all afternoon. By evening it was gone. Most people forgot about it by breakfast. Malcolm didn't. Neither did Dr. Leonard Brooks. The meteorologist returned 2 days later, carrying 3 large folders and a portable weather station. When Darius saw him unloading equipment, he assumed the scientist was being polite. A courtesy visit. Maybe a local interest story. Nothing more. Then Dr. Brooks spent 12 straight hours on the property. And came back the next day, and the day after that. By the 4th visit, people started talking. The diner conversations changed. The jokes became questions. Questions became rumors. Rumors became curiosity. One Friday morning, Curtis Holloway walked into Miller's diner and found 3 farmers discussing Malcolm Jefferson again. He sat down heavily. What now? One farmer stirred his coffee. State scientist keeps visiting him. So, 4 times this week, Curtis snorted. Maybe he's studying how not to farm. The table laughed, but not as hard as before. Not everyone joined in. Curtis noticed that, and he didn't like it. Across town, another problem was growing. The bank. Malcolm had always paid his debts, slowly, painfully, but reliably. This year was different. The tree project had cost more than expected. Fuel prices were climbing, wheat prices were falling, and the saplings themselves required maintenance. The letter arrived on a Monday, a final warning. Darius found it first. He read every line, twice. Then sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the paper. The old coffee mug beside him had gone cold. His father's notebook lay nearby. The same notebook. Always the same notebook. 6 years of measurements. 6 years of observations. 6 years of sacrifice. For what? When Malcolm entered the kitchen, Darius pushed the letter across the table. No words, just the letter. Malcolm read it, folded it, placed it beside the notebook, then sat down. The silence stretched. Finally Darius broke. What if you're wrong? The question landed harder than any insult from the county. Because it came from his son. What if all this? Darius gestured toward the window. The trees, the notebook, the years of research. What if you're wrong? Malcolm stared at the old brass watch in his palm. His father's watch. The crack in the glass caught the afternoon sunlight. For a moment he looked very old, older than 58, older than the farm itself. Then he quietly closed the watch. If I'm wrong. He stopped, his voice remained steady. We lose a farm. Darius waited. If I'm right. Another pause, this one longer. We save more than ours. The answer frustrated him, because it sounded impossible, and yet, his father genuinely believed it. That night Darius couldn't sleep. Around midnight he saw light coming from the barn. He walked across the yard. The windmill creaked overhead. A dog barked somewhere in the darkness. Inside the barn, Malcolm sat alone beneath a hanging work light. Not repairing equipment, not balancing finances, not even reading. He was studying maps, huge maps, county maps, weather maps, topographical maps. The walls were covered with them, red pins, blue pins, handwritten notes. Lines, locations, wind directions, elevation changes, drainage patterns, thousands of observations, years of work. Darius stood frozen, because for the first time he realized something. His father hadn't been studying his farm. He had been studying the entire county, for years, without telling anyone. Malcolm looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke, neither needed to. A new question had entered the room, one that would not leave. Why? The answer arrived sooner than either expected. 3 weeks later, Dr. Brooks requested an emergency meeting. Not at the university, not at the county office. At Malcolm Jefferson's farm. 23 farmers attended, mostly out of curiosity. Some came to laugh. Some came because they had heard rumors. Curtis Holloway came because he wanted to prove everyone was overreacting. The scientist stood beside a portable projector. Maps covered the wall behind him. Weather charts, historical wind data, rainfall records, satellite imagery. Then he pointed to Malcolm's notebook. The old leather notebook looked absurdly small compared to the equipment surrounding it. Yet Dr. Brooks treated it like evidence in a courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the barn. I believe Malcolm Jefferson discovered something important. The room shifted. No laughter, no jokes. Not this time. Dr. Brooks changed slides. A county map appeared, then another, then another. Every map showed the same wind speeds year after year, season after season, growing stronger, gradually, relentlessly, a trend almost nobody had noticed, except Malcolm. The scientist swallowed, then delivered the sentence that silenced the entire barn. If these patterns continue. He clicked the next slide. The image appeared. Several farmers actually leaned forward. Curtis stopped smiling. Darius felt his stomach tighten. The projection showed something terrifying. Not today, not next year, but 5 years from now. Large portions of Cottonwood County facing severe topsoil loss, crop instability, reduced moisture retention, economic damage. The room fell silent. Someone finally spoke. That's impossible. Dr. Brooks shook his head. No. Then he looked toward Malcolm. It's already beginning. Nobody laughed. Not a single person. Outside the barn, the evening wind pushed through the young rows of trees. Thousands of leaves rustled together, softly, like a warning nobody had wanted to hear. And standing near the back of the room, Curtis Holloway suddenly realized something that made his chest tighten. For 3 years, they had all been laughing at the only man who had seen the problem coming. The problem was, nobody yet knew how serious it really was. The drought announced itself quietly. That was the frightening part. Nobody woke up one morning and declared disaster. There was no dramatic siren, no emergency broadcast. Just small things. The creek behind the Simmons property stopped moving. Grass along fence lines turned pale 2 weeks earlier than normal. Farmers began checking the sky more often. And every evening, conversations at Miller's Diner lasted a little longer. People were worried. Nobody wanted to admit it. By late June, Cottonwood County had received less than half its normal rainfall. By July, the heat settled in like a weight. Day after day, week after week. The kind of heat that made machinery run hotter and tempers run shorter. The kind of heat that cracked pond bottoms and curled leaves before noon. Everywhere Malcolm went, people talked about weather. But now they weren't laughing anymore. Now they were asking questions. And that made some people uncomfortable. Especially Curtis Holloway. Because every week Malcolm's prediction looked a little less crazy. One afternoon Curtis stood at the edge of his largest wheat field. The soil beneath his boots crumbled like powder. His crop wasn't failing, not yet. But it wasn't thriving either. Something felt wrong. The same feeling had been following him for months. A feeling he hated. The feeling that Malcolm Jefferson might actually be right. Across the county, another problem was becoming impossible to ignore: the bank. 3 farms had already received foreclosure warnings. A 4th family quietly listed part of their land for sale. Nobody talked about it publicly. Everyone knew. In farming communities, bad news traveled faster than rain. One morning Darius drove into town to buy replacement parts. As he walked into the supply store, the conversation stopped. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for him to notice. Enough to know they had been talking about his father. A man near the register shook his head. I still think he's causing panic. Another nodded. People hear one scientist and suddenly they think the sky's falling. Darius said nothing. But as he loaded parts into his truck, he realized something strange. 6 months ago they laughed at Malcolm. Now they argued about him. That was different, much more dangerous. Because ridicule meant people dismissed you. Debate meant people were listening. Back on the farm, Malcolm continued working exactly as before. The same routine, the same notebook, the same weather station, the same evening walks through the tree rows. Sometimes Darius wondered if anything could rattle him. Then one night he found Malcolm sitting alone on the porch. The brass watch rested in his palm. Open, silent, the old man wasn't looking at the fields. He was looking at the horizon. Far away, somewhere beyond the farm. "You worried?" Darius asked. For several seconds Malcolm didn't answer, then he surprised him. "Yes." Darius blinked. His father rarely admitted fear. "What about?" The older man closed the watch. "The timing." "What timing?" Malcolm stood, looked toward the young trees, rows and rows of them stretching across the property, still growing, still years away from maturity. Then he quietly said something Darius would remember for the rest of his life. "I thought we'd have more time." The words settled heavily between them. The next morning the county received its first major dust advisory. By afternoon a second followed, then a third. Meteorologists began using phrases nobody liked hearing: severe soil movement, sustained wind event, agricultural impact zone. Dr. Brooks called Malcolm immediately. The scientist arrived before sunset. His face looked pale, exhausted. He carried a stack of fresh weather reports under one arm. "This system is accelerating." Malcolm studied the papers. Neither man liked what they saw. The projected wind speeds had increased significantly. "What changed?" Malcolm asked. Brooks exhaled slowly. "Nothing." That answer was somehow worse, because it meant the forecasts had been too optimistic. Outside, the trees rustled softly. Inside, both men knew something important. The county was about to receive a test. The kind that couldn't be solved with meetings, or reports, or opinions. 3 days later it arrived. The storm front appeared shortly after noon. Wall of dust stretched across the western horizon. Massive. Moving fast. At first people thought it was rain. Then they realized rain clouds were brown. Curtis saw it from his combine. The machine stopped. The engine idled. For several seconds he simply stared. The horizon looked alive. The wall grew taller, closer, wider. By 2 o'clock emergency alerts began appearing on local radio stations. Drivers were advised to stay off roads. Schools dismissed early. Businesses closed. The storm kept coming. By 3 o'clock the sky looked like dusk. By 4 o'clock it looked like night. Then the wind hit. Hard. The first gust rattled windows throughout the county. The second tore branches from trees. The third lifted soil directly from fields. Entire sections of exposed farmland began moving. Not inches, feet. Dust rolled across highways. Visibility collapsed. Power lines disappeared behind brown clouds. People locked doors and prayed. Inside his farmhouse, Darius watched from the front window. The scene looked unreal. The world beyond the glass had vanished. Only dust remained. The wind screamed around the house. Furniture vibrated. Old windows groaned. Then he remembered something: the trees. He grabbed his jacket and ran outside. Malcolm shouted after him, but Darius was already moving. The wind nearly knocked him down. Dust stung his face. Breathing hurt. Visibility was barely 30 feet, yet somehow he reached the nearest tree row, and what he saw stunned him. The trees were holding, bending, straining, but holding. Behind them, something incredible was happening. The soil remained in place. Not perfectly, not magically, but dramatically better than surrounding fields. The trees were breaking the wind, creating sheltered zones, protecting the ground beneath them. For the first time Darius saw his father's vision with his own eyes. Not on paper, not in notebooks, not in theories. Reality, violent, obvious, undeniable. Then came the second shock. A truck emerged from the dust, headlights barely visible. The vehicle swerved into Malcolm's driveway and stopped. The driver's door opened. Curtis Holloway stepped out. His face was covered with dust. His shirt looked gray instead of white. And for the first time since Darius had known him, Curtis looked frightened. Genuinely frightened. He stumbled toward Malcolm. The wind nearly swallowed his words, but they heard them. "Everyone. My west field is gone." Silence. Curtis swallowed hard. "I've never seen anything like this." The proud leader of Cottonwood County looked toward the rows of trees, toward the protected soil, toward the farm everyone had mocked. Then he asked the question nobody ever expected him to ask. "Malcolm." Another gust hit. Dust swirled around them. The trees groaned. The storm roared. And Curtis Holloway lowered his voice. "Tell me what I need to do." For a long moment Malcolm said nothing. Not because he was angry. Not because he wanted revenge. Because he understood what that question really meant. It wasn't about trees anymore. It wasn't about farming. It was about survival. And standing there beneath a sky full of dust, Malcolm realized something else. The storm outside wasn't the real crisis. The real crisis was what would happen after it ended. Because tomorrow morning, every farmer in Cottonwood County was going to see the damage. And for the first time, they were all going to compare it to his farm. The morning after the storm felt wrong. Too quiet, no wind, no movement, just silence. The kind of silence people hear after something important has already happened. By sunrise, trucks were already moving across Cottonwood County. Farmers left their homes before breakfast. Nobody had called a meeting. Nobody needed to. Everyone wanted to see the damage. Curtis Holloway drove first. The previous afternoon had been a blur of dust and fear. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his topsoil disappearing into the sky. The road leading to his western field looked different, darker. When he stepped out of the truck, his stomach dropped. Entire sections of exposed soil were gone. Not destroyed, gone. Years of accumulated topsoil had simply vanished. The land looked wounded, raw, stripped. Curtis walked through the field in silence. No calculations, no estimates, no excuses. He already knew. The loss would cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove toward Malcolm Jefferson's farm. He wasn't alone. By the time he arrived, nearly 20 vehicles were parked along the gravel road. Farmers stood near the fence line. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody laughed. They simply stared. The difference was impossible to ignore. On one side of the road, damaged fields stretched toward the horizon. On the other side stood Malcolm's farm, not untouched, not perfect, but alive. The young tree corridors had slowed the wind, protected the soil, reduced the damage. In several sections, the difference looked almost unbelievable. One elderly farmer removed his hat. He stood there for nearly a minute, then quietly whispered, "My God." The words spread through the crowd. Not because they were dramatic, because everyone felt the same thing. For 3 years they had mocked what they didn't understand. Now they were looking directly at the evidence, and evidence doesn't care about opinions. The visitors kept coming. 20 became 50. 50 became 100. Within a week, people were driving from neighboring counties to see the tree rows. Agricultural reporters appeared. University researchers arrived. State officials began calling. The small farm everyone had laughed at suddenly became the center of attention. Malcolm hated every minute of it. Not because he was uncomfortable. Because he still had work to do. While reporters wanted interviews, Malcolm was repairing irrigation lines. While photographers wanted pictures, Malcolm was planting replacement saplings. While experts debated theories, Malcolm was fixing broken fence posts. The farm still needed tending. Life still needed living. One afternoon, a television crew arrived from Oklahoma City. The reporter spent nearly 20 minutes preparing her introduction. When the cameras finally rolled, she asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Mr. Jefferson, how does it feel knowing you were right?" Malcolm looked genuinely confused. Then he pointed toward the damaged fields beyond his property. Farmers were still assessing losses. Some families faced devastating financial consequences. The old man shook his head. "I don't feel right." The reporter blinked. "What do you mean? I wish I'd been wrong." The interview ended there. That single answer appeared on television across the state. And somehow, it made people respect him even more. Because it wasn't victory he cared about. It was people. 2 months later, Oklahoma State University published its preliminary findings. Dr. Leonard Brooks and a team of researchers reviewed Malcolm's notebooks. Every page, every measurement, every observation. The conclusion shocked them. The patterns were real. The data was accurate. The predictions were scientifically valid. A professor described the notebooks as one of the most valuable long-term local climate records ever collected by a private citizen in the region. Reporters loved that quote. Malcolm ignored it. But one detail did matter. The university wanted copies. Every page, all 6 years. Darius helped organize them. Night after night they sat at the kitchen table sorting records. Wind measurements, rainfall logs, temperature charts, hand-drawn maps, thousands upon thousands of observations. During one of those evenings, Darius finally asked the question that had haunted him for years. "When did you know?" Malcolm looked up. "Know what? That you were right?" The older man smiled slightly, a tired smile, a human smile, the kind that carried more uncertainty than confidence. "I didn't." Darius frowned. "You never knew?" "No." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. The old brass watch rested beside the notebook. The 2 objects that had followed him through the entire journey. "I only knew I needed to keep paying attention." The answer stayed with Darius. Because it changed everything. People imagined great discoveries happen through certainty. Most of the time they happened through curiosity. Months passed. Winter arrived. The county slowly began adapting. Farmers planted their own tree corridors. Windbreak projects appeared throughout the region. State grants became available. Researchers returned repeatedly. What began as one man's idea slowly became a movement. But the final surprise came from somewhere nobody expected. The old watch. One snowy evening, Malcolm sat beside the fireplace cleaning mud from his boots. Darius was organizing family records, property documents, old photographs, insurance papers. The usual things people postpone for years. Inside a faded cardboard box he discovered a letter. The envelope looked ancient, yellowed, fragile. The handwriting belonged to Malcolm's father. Darius opened it carefully, then read. Halfway through he stopped, read it again, then carried the letter into the living room. Where did this come from? Malcolm looked up. His expression changed immediately. The letter. He hadn't seen it in decades. Slowly he unfolded the paper. The room became quiet. The fire crackled softly. Snow tapped against the windows. Darius watched as his father reread words written long before either of them imagined this future. Finally Malcolm handed him the letter. One paragraph had been underlined. Maybe 30 years ago. Maybe more. It read, "The people who save a farm are rarely the ones who work the hardest. They are the ones who notice what everyone else ignores." Darius looked up. The old man stared at the fire, silent. The brass watch rested in his hand, his father's watch, the same watch he had carried through every meeting, every storm, every doubt, every year of ridicule. Suddenly Darius understood. The trees had never been the real inheritance. The notebook wasn't either, neither was the farm. The real inheritance was attention. The willingness to observe, to learn, to remain curious when everyone else had already decided they knew the answer. 3 years after the storm, Curtis Holloway stood before a crowd of young agricultural students visiting the county. Many had heard the story, some had not. A student raised her hand. Was Malcolm Jefferson a genius? Curtis looked across the fields. Thousands of young trees now stretched across the landscape. Not just on Malcolm's land. Everywhere. He thought for a long moment, then shook his head. No. The students looked surprised. Curtis smiled. Choose something much harder to be. What? Curtis watched the wind move gently through the trees. The same wind that had nearly destroyed them all. The same wind Malcolm had noticed years before anyone else. Then he answered. He paid attention. Years later, visitors driving through Cottonwood County would notice something unusual. Rows of trees protecting fields in every direction. Green corridors cutting across the landscape. Most would never know where the idea started. Most would never hear Malcolm Jefferson's name. And honestly, that would have suited him just fine. Because he never wanted to be remembered as the man who was right. He wanted to be remembered as the neighbor who shared what he learned. The last time Darius saw his father walking the property, Malcolm stopped beside the oldest tree on the farm. The tree was tall now, strong, its roots deep, its branches stretching toward the Oklahoma sky. He touched the trunk gently, then checked the old brass watch one final time. Not because he cared what time it was, because some things remind us where wisdom came from. The wind moved softly through the leaves. The fields beyond remained protected. And for the first time in many years, Malcolm Jefferson simply stood there without measuring anything, without recording anything, without trying to solve anything, just listening, the same way he had listened all those years ago. To the one thing everyone else ignored, the wind.